Welcome VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this report. Now this week we're going to do things a little differently than usual. Instead of an update on the latest news headlines, we're going to take an in-depth look at the charters of three groups: Hamas, the PLO, and Hezbollah. Now these three groups are very different in many ways, but they all have the same goals and they all use asymmetric methods to pursue those goals. Kinetic violence and terrorism are common themes here, but there are also non-kinetic forms of violence like lawfare, propaganda, and diplomacy, all of which overlap in various ways. We'll take a closer look at this and offer some explanations and analysis of what it all means for people who care about Israel and want to pray for us here. All of that and much more is just ahead on this week's special edition of VFI News from Israel. We'll begin with some definitions and origin stories, starting with the PLO, since they were the first of these three organizations to be formed. Now, the Palestine Liberation Organization is actually a coalition of several factions that include the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, also known as Fatah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command, the Palestinian People's Party, the Arab Liberation Front, the Vanguard for the Popular Liberation War, the Palestinian Liberation Front, the Palestinian Arab Front, the Palestinian Democratic Union, and the Palestinian Popular Struggle Front. Fatah is by far the largest and most consequential of these groups, and I won't even try to explain the differences between all the smaller groups because, candidly, I doubt even they could tell you. Mainly the issue is that in Palestinian society, as in most Arab societies, the extended family clan one belongs to is the most important identity one has, and each extended family clan needs its own organization. It's all about pride, shame, honor, and prestige. It's most definitely not about achieving results, and we'll get into that more in a moment. But for now, it's enough for you to understand that Fatah is the largest of these groups, and it dominates the PLO in most respects. Now, the head of Fatah is usually also the head of the PLO, and for most of the last 20 years, that individual has also been the president and CEO of the Palestinian Authority, which has civil administration over several cities in Judea and Samaria, also known to many of you in the news as the West Bank. Speaking of the West Bank, the PLO was founded in 1964, 3 years before the Six-Day War, at a time when the West Bank was occupied by the Jordanian army. There was no talk in those days of a two-state solution, but there was and still is a lot of talk about annihilating Israel and putting a Palestinian state on its ruins. Be that as it may, by 1993, the PLO had mounted dozens of terrorist attacks against Israel, which had caused a lot of bloodshed and anguish, but had not brought any of the PLO's stated goals any closer. That might be because these goals were a hodgepodge meant to advance several different ideological positions, some of which were in at least conflict, if not contradiction with each other. They included in no particular order Palestinian nationalism, Arab nationalism, pan-Arabism, Arab socialism, secularism, and anti-imperialism. Students of political science and/or anthropology will immediately see the conflicts, but in case you never studied those topics, I'll briefly explain. The most striking contrast on this list is between Palestinian nationalism and pan-Arabism. Palestinian nationalism asserts that there is such a thing as a distinct Palestinian culture, language, religion, governing structure, economic structure, and many other things that make Palestinian a unique, distinct national group. Pan-Arabism asserts that all the Arabic-speaking peoples of the Middle East form one big nation, and they should all unite under one banner. This is supported and also contradicted by the anti-imperialism part of the PLO's ideology. That's because the only time the various people groups of the Middle East have ever been all together under one banner was when they were controlled by an imperial empire of some kind, whether it was the Abbasid, Umayyad, or Fatimid caliphates in the Middle Ages or later the Turkish-based Ottoman Empire. In contrast, the modern-day nation-states you see on a map of the Middle East are almost all the products of British and French imperialism. After the First World War, during which the British, with some help from the French, pushed the Ottoman Turks out of the Middle East, these two imperial powers carved up the region into spheres of influence, using local clients to administer certain areas. In the course of time, several of these areas were turned into kingdoms and semi-independent provinces, and then later they achieved full political independence and became nation-states, at least on the map. In reality, most of the countries you see on the map of the modern Middle East are, in fact, small empires. They're all encompassing many different ethnic, tribal, religious, and extended family clan substructures kept together by the iron-fisted rule of a highly centralized totalitarian or semi-totalitarian state. Think of Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Syria under the Assad regime, Jordan under the Hashemite dynasty, etc. Now, the PLO was founded with the idea of making Palestine such a mini-empire, and Fatah, the largest of the factions that made up the PLO, was meant to be this Palestinian state, what the Assad regime had been to Syria for most of its modern history. It is also worth mentioning that the PLO was heavily influenced by the Ba'ath Party, which was founded in Damascus, Syria in 1947, and borrowed heavily from both the Nazis and the Soviets. Both Syrian dictator Hafez al-Assad and Iraqi strongman Saddam Hussein were products of the Ba'ath Party, and Saddam's trademark mustache was a very deliberate riff on Stalin's facial hair, in case no one ever told you that. Anyway, the PLO had also elements that were nominally associated with the international communist movement, but that was never a dominating concern for them. It came in handy when PLO leaders needed something from the Soviets or the Chinese Communist Party, but in the grand scheme of things, it was not that very important. But there's one other thing you most certainly do not see in the charter of the PLO or in any of the ideological, political, or even cultural influences which form the character of the organization, and that is Islamism or jihadism. The PLO was an avowedly secular institution, and the Palestinian Authority, which became the public face of the PLO following the Oslo Accords in 1993, still is. That didn't work for many people in Palestinian society, who thought that Islam absolutely should be the central galvanizing element in the Palestinian national struggle. One of those people was Sheikh Ahmed Ismail Hassan Yassin, who helped found the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood organization in Gaza in 1973. So later in 1987, this would form the foundation of Hamas, which Yassin was the spiritual leader of alongside Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi, a medical scholar and political leader of Hamas. Both of these men would be assassinated by Israel in the spring of 2004. But by then, a very large, sophisticated, and dangerous terrorist organization had been built up, guided by a charter which called for the violent destruction of Israel so it could be replaced by a Palestinian state governed by Islamic Sharia law. This charter also has some rather broad hints that the long-term vision was pan-Islamist, which is in line with the general vision of the Muslim Brotherhood organization that Hamas grew out of and is still seen as the franchise in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. Now, there's a few very important points that I must make here. First, the Muslim Brotherhood also has a franchise among Israeli Arabs, and it's called the Islamic Movement in Israel. It has a northern branch and a southern branch, and is loosely affiliated with political parties that sometimes manage to get some of their representatives elected to the Knesset. In many other respects, it operates legally in this country for reasons I have a difficult time understanding. But the next time you hear someone accuse Israel of being an apartheid state, this is a good point to bring up to refute that accusation. Another point I must bring up is that in the early days of its existence, Hamas received support from the Israeli intelligence services. The idea was that allowing the emergence of an Islamist movement in the territories would provide a distraction for the PLO, which, remember, was and is secular in its outlook. To be fair to the Israeli intelligence services in the late 1980s, they're not the first group to make such a bad decision. Remember that the Kaiser's regime in Germany sent Lenin back to Russia in 1916, hoping that he would start a revolution in that country that would depose the Tsar and knock Russia out of the First World War. A few generations before that, the Tsar supported the Union in the American Civil War. thinking that a strong America would make problems for their great enemy, England, and so on. History is full of examples of this kind of thing, and we should never forget what that great American philosopher Yogi Berra said, that predictions are hard, especially about the future. Isn't that true? That having been said, the charter that Hamas drafted in 1988 should have given everyone some clues about what they were thinking. Among other things, it said that the struggle Hamas was waging was, quote, against the Jews, unquote, and made several other blatantly anti-Semitic statements and, in general, framed the conflict in theological terms. Now, this language borrowed heavily from the broad theological position of the Muslim Brotherhood organization, which takes a very hardline Orthodox view of Quranic teachings. These teachings do not make room for the modern Enlightenment principles like equality before the law, separation of religion and state, basic human rights, and so on and so forth. The Hamas Charter is a product of this kind of Orthodox fundamentalist Islam, and one of the basic tenets of it is that once a piece of real estate on this earth's surface has come under the political sovereignty of Islam, it is forbidden for it to ever be controlled by a non-Islamic political entity. Since the territory of what is today Israel, especially the city of Jerusalem, was actually under the political sovereignty of one kind of Islamic entity or another for most of the past 2,000 years, that makes it absolutely forbidden for anyone else to control it. That is especially true of the Jews, because if the Jews control Jerusalem, that raises all kinds of theological questions that Islam doesn't have any good answers to. In this context, it's important to mention that the Crusaders, who were Catholic Christians from mostly Western European countries, controlled this territory for about 200 years, for most of the 11th and 12th centuries AD. To most Muslims, this is something that they consider to have happened the day before yesterday, and they continue to draw lessons from it. One lesson is that the Crusaders were eventually driven out, and they believe that Israel is just a modern-day iteration of the same phenomenon and will be driven out just as the Crusaders eventually were. You will never understand the Middle East if you don't understand this mentality. Another thing you need to understand is a couple of other phrases from the original Hamas charter, including the phrase, quote, Israel exists and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, unquote. Notice it doesn't say Hamas will obliterate it, it says Islam will. That lets you know that Hamas doesn't see itself as a small group. It sees itself as a small part of a much larger movement, and in a very real way, they are correct to think this way. Another phrase from the original Hamas charter you must understand is a quote it takes from the Quran, the Muslim holy book, which says, quote, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him, unquote. Yes, that's what the Quran says. Can you believe it? Now, sometimes evangelical Christians are accused of only supporting Israel because they hope it will bring about the rapture, the revealing of the Antichrist, and the second advent of Jesus Christ on the earth. I'm here to tell you that there's some truth to that. There definitely are some evangelical Christians who think that way, but they're a small minority within the larger Christian Zionist movement. Furthermore, if someone is unhappy about the existence of this small minority of people who support Israel for a problematic reason, shouldn't they be much more unhappy about the fact that the other people oppose Israel for this much worse reason? The world is upside down, friends, and I don't have to tell you that. And here at Vision for Israel, that's visionforisrael.com, we support Israel because the Bible gives us so many good reasons to do so. That includes assisting Israeli families and communities in distress, so please watch this short video about some of the ways we're doing just that.
years, Vision for Israel has been hosting the Holocaust survivors and terror victims and widows and orphans and children at risk, at high risk. And of course, that after the October 7th, people were really in distress. And a lot of the Holocaust survivors, they had this kind of bad pictures from the past that would come back to them. And many of them were having to deal with their emotional state of being in depression and being not able to cope with the horrible tragedies that took place. So we initiated to inviting them again to do these musical mornings. And what we do is we bring a musician, we bring food, they're doing dancing and everything. And it's just a very light, enjoyable time. And I tell you, when they come to us, most of them are telling us that when they come, they just feel peace. They just feel joy. And they said, something is very special about your place. We just love coming to your place. Please invite us again. And it was like always repeating the same thing.
I think one of the great things about serving the Holocaust survivors is as they are getting older very quickly, 10 to 15,000 of the survivors are passing on into eternity every year. And so we owe a great debt to this generation of Holocaust survivors who we want to keep their memories, their biographies, their history alive. And when we host an event for the Holocaust survivors, I'm reminded of the words that I love so much in Job chapter 29, verse 13. It says, "The blessing of a perishing man came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy." And whenever the Holocaust survivors come, many of them who are widows and widowers, of course, are these elderly women who love to dance, who love to grab my arms and just swing me around. And I'm amazed at the energy that they have to dance and to sing and to have fun and to make the most out of life, which I think is so rewarding, such a blessing for us. We've even been able to dedicate ambulances that we donated to the service of Israel in order to make and uplift their own countenance and happy to be part of something giving back to the community. So it really is a blessing, and I think we owe the Holocaust survivors a great debt and to keep their memories alive. Welcome back, friends. Now, once again, an astute observer of the first two segments in this report will notice that the PLO charter and the original Hamas charter, which were both later amended to give somewhat more pragmatic framings to the arguments they make, nevertheless have a lot in common. They both define this country as belonging by natural right to the Palestinians, and they both define Jews as Israelis, as usurpers who have no business setting up an independent nation state here. They also both justify violence and terrorism to push what they define as a usurping entity out. And they both also make us of many non-kinetic forms of violence against Israel and anyone else they see as their enemies. This includes propaganda, which is picked up and magnified by many of their fellow travelers in the global left, and I'm sure I don't even need to explain much about that. It also includes what is sometimes called lawfare, which means opening cases against Israel at the UN tribunals, including the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. It costs Israel a tremendous amount of time, money, and effort to deal with all this. But this is just one more arena where Israel has to constantly fight for its existence. Another arena is the northern border region, and of course, that is where Israel confronts its most dangerous non-state enemy, the Lebanese Shiite terror militia known as Hezbollah. Hezbollah is very different from either the PLO or Hamas for several different reasons, starting with the fact that Hezbollah is made up of people who are not Palestinians, and also they are Shiite Muslims, not Sunni Muslims, as almost all the Palestinians are. Most of the world's Shiite Muslims live in Iran, and they are not ethnically Arabs. Remember before when I said that most of the nation states in the Middle East are composed of several different ethnic, religious, and tribal groups? Nowhere is this more the case than in Lebanon, which doesn't even have a majority population anymore, but rather several different minorities, including Orthodox and Catholic Christians, Sunni and Shiite Muslims, Druze, and others exist. When the IDF invaded Lebanon in 1982 in pursuit of the PLO, the Shiites of southern Lebanon found themselves unable to do anything about their territory being used as a battlefield by others. So, they reached out to the new Ayatollah regime in Iran for help, and the Ayatollahs jumped at the opportunity to gain a foothold on the Mediterranean. Despite being locked in a life-or-death struggle with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, just 2.5 years after they had overthrown the Shah to take control of Iran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps sent 1,500 advisors and millions of dollars worth of weapons and equipment to Hezbollah. There were a few different Shiite factions trying to get organized in Lebanon, but the IRGC picked Hezbollah as the most ideological aligned with them and convinced all the other factions to fold themselves into Hezbollah, which in Arabic means the party of God. How could anyone say no to that, especially with millions of dollars at hand? Well, Israel's war with the PLO in Lebanon ended in late 1982 with Yasser Arafat and the rest of the PLO leadership being exiled to Tunisia. That should have been the end of the story as far as the IDF was concerned. But because Israel had allies among the Lebanese Christian militias who had assisted in pushing out the PLO, it was impossible for the IDF to just walk away. Instead, there was a gradual withdrawal to a buffer zone just north of the Israeli-Lebanese border, and the IDF stayed in that buffer zone until 2000. All during that time, Hezbollah was building its strength, fueled by an appeal to Lebanon's national honor, and that was deeply hypocritical since they were getting so much assistance from Iran, but also very effective. Now remember that, like the PLO, Hezbollah started out as an alliance of several different Shiite factions, so there was some contradictions in their founding charter as well. It was heavily influenced by the so-called, quote, Hezbollah program, unquote, which was presented at the organization's formal founding on February 16, 1985. The full name of this statement was the Hezbollah Program, an open letter to all the oppressed in Lebanon and the world, and it included elements of pan-Arabism, pan-Islamism, and an appeal for everyone to choose their own governing structure but also emulate the Ayatollah regime in Iran, just as Hezbollah was doing. Hezbollah's charter also includes elements of anti-imperialism, which in the Lebanese context means they don't want America or France to have any control over what happens in the country. By 2006, they'd built a large arsenal of rockets and missiles, and in the Second Lebanon War, which broke out in the summer, they launched over 4,000 rockets into the Galilee. Now, we can look back on that now and laugh because in the last 2 years, about 10 times that number of weapons have been fired at Israel, including very large ballistic missiles from Iran. But back in 2006, Israel didn't have the Iron Dome or any other active defense against incoming rockets and missiles. All we had were old-fashioned protected spaces and bomb shelters, and many of them were in bad shape because they hadn't been used in so long they had fallen into disrepair. It was in the aftermath of this war and amidst the escalating rocket fire from Hamas in the Gaza Strip, which began around that time, that Israeli communities began to request help in placing portable bomb safety shelters. Vision for Israel was among the first organizations to answer this call in a massive way, and we're still placing these shelters in communities all over the country. So please watch this short video about this still very important project. Vision for Israel has been installing bomb safety shelters since actually around the fall of 2021. During that year, there was a barrage of rockets that came into southern Israel, particularly by the terrorist group known as Hamas, and Israel had to find a way further in order to protect its citizens, its residents across the southern part of Israel. And so we sprung into action. We felt like this was a project that we had a personal invitation to fulfill. And it's important because when these projectiles, these missiles, these rockets whatever that is that's thrown at Israel by its enemies, there is not only the potential for somebody being killed instantly, but also there's tremendous collateral damage and people that get wounded even from shrapnel. And so if you place a safety shelter at a bus stop, or in front of a high school or community center or a kindergarten or any kind of facility that's publicly accessible, the people can run into these shelters. The children can run and find safety in them and be protected from a rocket that lands and shrapnel is scattered, which could be mortally wounding people. So it gives not only a physical protection of security, but also an emotional sense of security that you know, having a shelter that you can run to in the street, outside of a store, somewhere publicly accessible, not just in someone's home, but out in the open, gives a sense of security. And I always believe that it's important for us to refer to Scripture. And Psalm 91, the whole chapter talks about God providing us a shelter. And we have seen amazing deliverances from enemy rockets as a result. And now we've installed over 400 shelters across the southern and northern borders of Israel. And they weigh 30,000 kilos each, or that's 30 tons. And it's a lot of weight on rebar and concrete that's been specially mixed, and also with a special metal ramp that allows physically impaired people to be able to come up in a walker or a wheelchair on a moment's notice. In many of these areas, residents don't have any longer than between 5 seconds to maximum 45 seconds to get into a shelter to be protected. Welcome back, friends. Now we're almost out of time for this special edition of VFI News, so I'm going to try and wrap things up, pointing out that the PLO, Hamas, and Hezbollah have many differences, but they also have one very important thing in common. They all want to see Israel completely destroyed. They've got different reasons, including a mix of nationalism and theological reasons, and they use different tools to advance this goal, including everything from legal briefs at the International Criminal Court to ballistic missiles. But in the end, the overall goal is the same. This is a spiritual war. The state of Israel is a sign to the whole world that the God described in the Bible keeps his promises. But there are other gods with a small g, described in other books that have a different narrative about God. This is the heart of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, and many other challenges Israel faces all over the world. The founding documents of the PLO, Hamas, and Hezbollah are merely a reflection of a larger reality. And that's why everyone who cares about Israel should read them and pay very close attention to what they say. With that, I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another special edition of VFI News from Israel. God bless you and shalom.